So this video is to help you complete pages 2 through 5, and you may have done some of it in class, but we're going to kind of do it all over again so that you make sure you understand this. So number 1 says, use the fact that secant of u equals -3 over 2 and tangent of u is greater than 0 to find the other 6, it should say, 5 trig functions, because you know the value of one of them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw. So I'm going to draw my little quadrant plane, and it says that secant's negative. So if secant's negative, cosine was negative, and cosine's negative in quadrants 2 and 3, so I'm crossing off quadrants 1 and 4. And then to figure out which one of these 2 quadrants I'm going to be in, I need to use my second piece of information. So secant of any angle is equal to r over x. And we know from this statement right here that this has to be negative. Well, r is never negative, so now we know the x is negative. And then if we do tangent of any angle, theta, is equal to y over x. And for y over x to be greater than 0, that means that y divided by x was positive. So if this is going to be positive, and we know that x is negative, then that y also had to be negative. So now we know that y also has to be negative, which means I have to draw my triangle in the bottom third quadrant, because that's where x and y are both negative. And now I can label some stuff. I know that r is going to be 3, and x is going to be -2 from using secant r over x, and the r can't take the negative, so the x has to. And then we can do Pythagorean theorem in reverse, so 9 squared, oh, not 9 squared, sorry, 3 squared is 9. 9 minus 4 is going to equal y squared, so the square root of 5 equals y. It's really plus or minus the square root of 5, and because you're in the third quadrant, it's -5. So now that you have your triangle drawn, you can go ahead and find your trig function. So cosine u, sine u, tangent u. We already know secant, so cosecant u and cotangent u. If secant is -3 over 2, then cosine was -2 over 3. Sine is y over r, so -5 over 3. Tangent's y over x, so -5 over -2, which is just going to equal √5 over 2. Cosecant is the reciprocal of sine, so -3 over √5, and you have to rationalize it, so -3 √5 over 5. And cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent, so 2 over √5, and again rationalizing, so 2 √5 over 5. So that was a great math review. So now let's jump on into the algebra. Number 2 says we need to simplify. So if I look at this and I need to simplify, I gave you a hint off to the side. It says make factoring your friend. So these both have a sign in them. So I'm going to pull out a sign. And here I'm left with my cosine squared x, and then here I'm left with this 1 right here, so -1. Anytime you see a cosine squared or a sine squared with a 1 plus or minus by it, you should think Pythagorean identities, which are right here on your formula sheet, right here. So I'm going to copy this top one down, sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. So sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta equals 1. Well, I don't have a sine squared, I have a cosine and a 1, so I'm going to move my cosine squared over. So I know that sine squared theta is equal to 1 minus cosine squared theta, which isn't quite this. The signs, the SIGNs, not the trig function sign, but the plus or minus signs are backwards. This one's positive and cosine's negative, and this has a positive cosine but a -1. So I'm going to multiply everything here by a -1. So negative sine squared theta equals -1 plus cosine squared theta, which is the same thing as saying cosine squared theta -1. So now you know that cosine squared theta -1 is a negative sine squared. So right here, I'm not going to write cosine squared -1. I'm going to write sine of x times the negative sine squared of x. 1 sine times a sine squared, or an x times an x squared, is going to get you an x cubed. So I now have sine cubed x, and one of them was negative, so a negative times a positive is a negative. Okay. The next one says that you need to simplify. And so when you look at this, I'm going to try the same trick I just did up here. Can I factor? Well, nothing here is the same, so there's no factoring, but I have a squared trig function. Anytime you have a squared trig function, the first place you need to go look is Pythagorean identities, because maybe I can change this cosecant squared to look like a cotangent so that I can factor. And in fact, it says right here that cosecant squared is the same thing as 1 plus cotangent. So I'm going to replace my cosecant, this piece right here is getting replaced, with 1 plus cotangent squared x, and then I'm going to copy down the rest of this, minus cotangent x minus 3. I'm going to combine like terms, cotangent squared x minus cotangent x minus 2, and then we could even factor it. And if you can't see how to factor this, I'm going to rewrite it for a second. Instead of calling this cotangent, let's just call it c squared minus c minus 2. I know that you can factor that. It's going to be c minus 2 and c plus 1, but we didn't have c's, we had cotangents, so cotangent x minus 2, cotangent x plus 1. And this is as simplified as it gets because there's nothing else I can do to that expression. So now let's go on to page 3. So page 3 up top says again to simplify into one trig function. So I'm only allowed to have one trig function. Nothing here is squared, and so the next thing I'm going to think about is, okay, I have a sine and a cosine, and we don't in general write sine and cosine. Sine and cosine is as simple as it gets, but I can rewrite cotangent. Cotangent we know is equal to x over y, which is also the same thing as cosine over sine. And if you didn't know that, it is right up top in your cotangent identities. And so now I'm going to rewrite this. Sine of t plus, parentheses, cosine t over sine of t times cosine t over 1. So just by doing some algebra, cosine of t, I'm going to put parentheses so that this doesn't look like cent and cost. So cosine of t plus cosine times cosine is going to be a cosine squared t. Sine times 1 is sine t. I need to find common denominators because this is a fraction and this isn't, so I'm going to multiply the sine by a sine of t over a sine of t. And so now I get sine squared t over sine of t plus cosine squared t over sine of t. And now because I have common denominators, I can add them. Well, sine squared plus cosine squared. You have to know that. Sine squared plus cosine squared. That is the very first and most important Pythagorean identity. Sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. So sine squared plus cosine squared is equal to 1 on top. And I could add them because their common denominator was sine of t. So I have 1 over sine of t, which is also known as cosecant of t. Okay, so I'm going to start you on number 5, and then you're going to finish it and go back to Edmodo and watch the next video so that you can see if you got it right. So it says perform addition and simplify. Hint, find a common denominator. Just like old school math, if you wanted to add 1 over 4 plus 1 over 7, you'd multiply the first fraction by 7 over 7, and you'd multiply the second fraction by 4 over 4 so that you could find common denominators. So in this case, I'm going to multiply the second fraction by 1 plus cosine theta over 1 plus cosine theta, and I'm going to multiply the first fraction by sine of theta over sine of theta. So you're going to stop the video and go back to Edmodo after you finish the problem and check in and see if you got the answer right.